You're listening to Talk Poverty Radio on the We Act Radio Network. I'm Rebecca Vallis. And with me to talk about how disability fits into civil rights is Rebecca Coakley. She's the Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. Thanks for joining us, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. I'm thrilled to be here.
So tell us a little bit about you. I mean, you've been at NCD for a while, but you've got a rich history of the kinds of work that you've done.
I've been at the National Council on Disability as the Executive Director for about 2.5 years now. Prior to that, I had a stint over at the Administration for Community Living, which was phenomenal. I got to work with Kathy Greenlee and Henry Claypool and those folks. Prior to that, I spent over 2 years at the White House as the Director of Priority Placement for Public Engagement. So I was responsible for outreach and recruitment of all of our diversity groups for roles in the administration. So I was responsible for engaging with race, ethnic, religious minorities, people with disabilities, the LGBT community, women, veterans, and recent college graduates. But I've worked in sort of the broad civil rights space for most of my life. Both my parents are little people, unlike most people with disabilities. I grew up with a sense of disability as already part of diversity from birth. My mom was a disabled students counselor, and so growing up in San Francisco during the height of the AIDS crisis, she lost a number of her students. And many times, we ended up being the only people at their funerals because to my parents, it was important that somebody was there. And so growing up with a sense of how disability sort of fit into both, the LGBT community and even the broader civil rights work. My dad was the son of a federal judge in Alabama who was responsible for throwing multiple freedom riders in jail. There are multiple pages about my paternal grandfather in Congressman Lewis's autobiography, and we joke about it frequently when we run into each other. But my parents really did have that core value of injustice anywhere calls for justice everywhere, and really raised me with that. And so growing up in the Bay Area, being engaged in disability rights from birth, now being in a mixed-race marriage, raising 2 African-American kids with disabilities, being able to really drive a civil rights agenda and narrative within the work at the council. And then also be able to drive a disability rights narrative within the broader dialogue of civil rights is easily the favorite thing that I do.
And people often think about civil rights as being about race, right? And that's sort of that's where your brain goes when you hear the phrase civil rights movement. You describe the two movements, disability rights and civil rights, as being interdependent, but do you see them as overlapping or related?
I think they definitely overlap. I mean, I think when you're looking at issues of students of color in special education and in the juvenile justice system, there is significant overlap. When you're looking at issues of immigration and detention, a large number of people in detention for immigration issues are people with disabilities. When you look at the issues of poverty and homelessness, disability definitely comes in. When you look at veterans issues, disability comes in. When you look at women's issues, women are more likely to be caregivers with disabilities, caring for an elder parent or a child. And so disability really fundamentally runs through all of these movements.
We've seen over the years the progressive movement bring in racial justice, LGBT justice as sort of core to the progressive movement. Those are issues that even if you are not a person of color, even if you do not identify as LGBT, those are still issues you care about, much as, climate change has sort of become a core progressive value. How do we get to the point where disability is there? I mean, we have 1 in 5 Americans live with a disability, so it's not like it's some, tiny minority that we're talking about. How do we get to a point where it's a core progressive value and issue?
I think there's a couple of different ways to approach it. One, I think it's sort of an inside-outside game to a certain extent. I think one way is our community has to reflect those communities. We have to be serious and deliberate about developing disabled leaders of color who are members of the NAACP, the National Action Network, the National Congress of Negro Women, the National Council of La Raza. We have to develop disability leaders who are LGBTQIA. And we have to support those parts of their identity. And we have to see that reflected in our leadership. We have to see that reflected in our conferences. And we have to see that integrated in our rhetoric and the language that we use when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about what our community looks like. The other piece of it, and I go back to what my colleague Talila Lewis says and what Kaite Davidson used to say, which is we spend a lot of time worrying about finding allies and not enough about creating allies. And so I think there is something to that. When I think about people that I've worked with over the years, relationships I've developed, colleagues I've done some really neat things with, who may have had nothing to do with disability, but they knew somebody who had a disability, or they had had a hip replacement, or they went to school with someone, or they had a teacher who was deaf, or they had some tangible connection. Or we were even able to approach it from the case of, okay, you're really active in the trans rights community, and saying, okay, let's talk about disability and trans and talk about sort of the growing fights that both of our movements have had and where there's overlap and where there's intersectionality. And I think part of the challenge is not being afraid. You brought up the environmental movement, and I think that's a good case to look at. I think so many times people see, preservation as anti-ADA, or, discussions of, new technology that the disability community wants leading to more pollution, or whatever the case may be, rather than focusing on places where it works. And I think a great example of that is our colleagues in Chicago at Access Living have built easily one of the top independent living centers in the country, and it's also one of Chicago's biggest green buildings. And I think looking at finding those intersections, in that case, the intersection of green design and universal design in architecture, and highlighting those things as examples of where it works. I think also for us, it's being able to have those allies that understand that disability is not a bad thing. I had a conversation with some folks this last week talking about disproportionality of students of color in special education. And yes, that's a huge issue. But at the same time, if we say, okay, we're going to, let's just say we X'd out any students of color in special education, what happens to those students that need the services? And so I think having that conversation about disability in the context of rights. Your son has a learning disability. Your son is autistic. Your daughter is autistic. There's very little data about girls of color with autism. Okay, your daughter is African American or Latina and autistic. You're afraid of them going into special education because of the further stigmatization. But let's look at the services. Let's look at IDEA from the context of these are the things that we can use to help set your child up for success. And it will help them in the long run. It will help them be successful in the long run. No parent is going to say no to that. But if you talk about special education as a place, we're taking your kid out, we're segregating your child and putting them over there. No parent, I wouldn't sign off on that as a parent. And so sometimes how we frame the issues from a rights basis versus a stigma perspective, I think is a real opportunity. But I think that there's always the challenge that these movements face in addressing disability and decentering the conversation, whether it be on race, on ethnicity, on religion, on gender, because they don't want to dilute the message. But we see it as how can disability add further lens, add further perspective, and bring more people to the collective table to talk about the issues groups are facing.
An issue that has really sort of surfaced as the modern day civil rights battle that we're fighting is criminal justice reform. And we're actually seeing a lot of bipartisan momentum around the need for criminal justice reform, although people are coming at it from different places. Does disability have a place here, and is that something that you're working on?
Oh, definitely. It's something that I can say my team and I over at the National Council on Disability and a number of colleagues in the disability community are engaged in. And I have to say it's very exciting because disability is at the table with the broader civil rights groups. We've been working with groups like the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Leadership Conference, and other organizations that are pushing broad-based criminal justice and police reform. And it's been exciting to see disability not be segregated to the short bus in this conversation, as our issues tend to be. And I think part of it has been because we've been able to come to the table with a value add. For example, we know that in New Mexico, 75% of police shootings have been, the victims have been people with mental health disabilities.
75%.
75%. In the state of New Mexico. As we have conversations about the data collection piece, I think disability really comes into it. We don't have good data on disability and police violence. And even in the Death in Custody Act, in the last reauthorization, disability wasn't included as one of those categories, which we definitely would like to see in any sort of potential reauthorization or amendment. But tied to that, too, I mean, I think it would be really important and really critical to look at disabilities that have occurred or that somebody has acquired while in police custody, to look at sort of the Freddie Gray case. As an example, how many disabilities are acquired while somebody is in custody from the time that they're arrested through processing, et cetera. I think, looking at Ferguson specifically, we've heard a number of times from people with disabilities who are down there in that area, activists like Heather Damian and others who, Heather, for example, was removed from her wheelchair. And she had GoPros mounted to her chair, and police removed her from her chair. And the other protesters got engaged and were very upset about it because Heather's been there since day one as a resident of the area, filming what's been going on. And I think as we have these conversations, people continue to point to CIT training, crisis intervention training, as the answer. But as we look at CIT training, it only specifically typically looks at mental health and intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's not a solution. 8 hours of training does not teach every law enforcement officer how to approach any person with any type of disability. These issues are not specific just to mental health and IDDD, but more broadly, we have cases of people who have seizure disorders, having a seizure in the car and getting shot by cops. We had somebody who was tased repeatedly I believe they were deaf, and the car ran over them. Or even the case actually in Fairfax County a couple of weeks ago where it came out that Fairfax County police had arrested a gentleman, a Nigerian immigrant who was deaf, who was in police custody for 6 weeks for supposedly stealing an iPad at National Airport, which they later found and recovered that and learned that he hadn't stolen it. But he was in jail for 6 weeks without a sign language interpreter. 6 weeks without being able to ask for your basic human needs because they're denying you reasonable accommodations. And so I think there really is a disability voice in this conversation. And, and as I remind my allies frequently in the disability community, it is critical while our voice is there that we center the conversation. We don't decentralize the Black Lives Matter conversation. This is not an all lives matter conversation, or Black Lives Matter and disability lives matter too. Rather, in the context of Black Lives Matter, not losing sight that within Black Lives Matter, there are Black people with disabilities that are running into these incidents over and over again. And we need to be addressing these issues. And as we address them, we'll see overall improvement for the entire community.
So we're also celebrating a major anniversary for the Americans with Disabilities Act this year, the ADA. There's often discussion about a so-called ADA generation. And I think you technically would be part of the ADA generation. Mm-hmm. You are not a pale, stale male dude in a wheelchair. Can you talk a little bit about what the future of the us looks like?
Definitely. The term ADA generation was something we actually coined years ago to really be able to differentiate and to really point out what happens when you have IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which actually turns 40 this fall, intersect with the ADA. So you have young people with disabilities who ideally have been included in K-12 public education, receiving free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment, engaging with their peers. I think it fundamentally shapes the diversity of our country. I think when you think about how prior to IDEA, when you would look across a classroom, prior to IDEA and post Brown v. Board, you saw one type of diversity enter the classroom. However, if you talk to most folks our age, and they're, mid-30s and younger, they have no memory of a time when students with disabilities were not in public schools. And so that shapes the brain. That shapes how people think about diversity. They don't remember a time when Linda the librarian was not on Sesame Street as one of the most widely known disabled characters. Or teenagers today, because I don't let my kids watch it, even though they should, are not going to remember a time pre-Peter Dinklage being on television and what the portrayal of Tyrion Lannister has meant. My husband refers to Tyrion Lannister as the modern Sidney Poitier, as the modern role of Mr. Tibbs to a certain effect.
And you're talking, of course, about the popular show Game of Thrones.
Yes, I'm talking about Game of Thrones. And I think when we talk about the future of our movement and what that means, it means young people that are graduating today with the expectation of employment. Young people that are graduating today and saying, like all other college kids, I may go bunk at home for a year and a half after I graduate, but that doesn't mean I can't go get a job. I think there's also an ongoing conversation, as there is any time there is a war, about attention to veterans issues and veterans with disabilities. I was talking to a colleague who runs an internship program for interns with disabilities recently, and he said, well, over here at the VA, our folks are going to be hesitant because it's got the word disability in there. And to me, that's sad. To me, when I hear that people use terms like special needs or handy-capable or differently abled, it's sad and it's frustrating, both because it's very paternalistic, but also it disconnects people from their civil rights. Nowhere in IDEA, ADA, or any other piece of disability public policy will you see the word special needs. Will you see handy-capable? Those words were created by non-disabled people to make them feel better about disability. And so when I claim disability, I claim it like the armor I wear. I claim disability as an act, as a political action, as an act of claiming my civil rights. And so as we see people with disabilities, particularly young people with disabilities, make the fight to claim that, it really is a political action. And we're a growing politicized community in a lot of ways, I think. It'll be interesting to see over the next several years where this community moves and what it really deems its priorities, because they're not just seeing disability issues only as their concern. They're also people of color. They're also people who are LGBTQIA. They don't see their identity as a hat that they switch off. That before, whether it was the movement forcing them, their family sort of forcing them, or their own feeling like they could only wear one identity at a time, we're really seeing a shift in that direction. And I think that also leads to the broader conversation on disability rights as part of civil rights.
Rebecca Coakley, Executive Director of the National Council on Disability. We could talk for hours.
Oh, definitely.
I wish we had the entire episode for this, but I guess that just means we'll have to have you back.
Definitely. I'd love it.